A Better World Blueprint. Good humans doing good things.
Hello. This is a podcast that highlights people who make the world a better place. Because sometimes we need a bit of inspiration in our day. This is A Better World Blueprint. Anne Gately counts herself a lucky woman. Diagnosed with stage 4 melanoma in 2018, she was given immunotherapy treatment. In just 97 days, she went from diagnosis to no active cancer. Only about 50% of people with advanced melanoma will respond to immunotherapy treatment. And those who responded as well as Anne, that number is much less. Grateful for her health, Anne decided to use the power of her own story to try and change Australia's attitude to skincare in the sun. She wrote a memoir, Sunburnt, and started to share her story as widely as she could. This is my chat with author and advocate, Anne Gately. Hello, Anne, and thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Hi, Siobhan. Lovely to be here.
You are an author and an advocate for people experiencing melanoma. And one of my first questions is normally what led you to this work. But obviously, a stage 4 diagnosis is a life-changing event, however you look at it. But I guess for me anyway, the cancer diagnosis and dealing with cancer and the treatment is one thing. Going on from that to write a book and become an advocate is quite another. What made you or what led you to the decision to write the book and then become such a public face of melanoma treatment and supporting patients?
A couple of months after I had my clear scan, I have two sons, and at the time they were 17 and 21. Both of them came home sunburnt. And I totally lost my mind over it because they knew, I'd had to sit them down and say, I have an incurable disease. The treatment I'm having is just about buying me more time. And then here they come home sunburnt. And then a couple of months later, I was working, and my background's in marketing and advertising, and I was reviewing a new creative campaign. And an execution came across my desk which was glorifying tanning. And I had a visceral reaction to that. And I thought, I can't send that message out into the world. And that's when I realised, though, that there was nothing stopping anyone else in the marketing or advertising industry from putting messaging out there. There is nothing in the advertising guidelines about this. And it's really up to the individual or the organisation themselves as to whether or not they're conscious about kind of the sun protection or sun tanning messages they're putting out there. So that's when I decided that I was in a unique position to be able to play a role in this, because my career of 30 years had been in advertising and marketing. And I thought, I think I'm going to tell people about this, and explain to them in the industry how they're impacting on the cultural norm and influencing tanning and things like that. So the first thing I did was I put together a presentation. So my plan was I was going to go into agencies and marketing departments and tell my story. So I put together a presentation, and the first presentation I did was in the company that I was working at, which was a new contract after I'd been unwell. And I hadn't even told anyone that I'd had stage 4 melanoma at the time. Like, my boss knew because I'd worked with her before. And I gave this presentation at work, which was pretty difficult the first time I did it. I was kind of, hanging on to myself. I got through it without crying, but, it was very emotional for me. And then I started reaching out to friends and, ex-colleagues I had in the industry and said, can I come in and tell my story? So that's what I started to do. And unfortunately, COVID hit. So those kind of presentations went on hold. I did a few that were virtual, but I felt that doing them in person, had more impact. And after doing the presentations that I did do, I had feedback from people telling me how it had affected them, how they started to change their behaviour. And I thought, maybe more people need to hear my story. And then in terms of advocacy, because I was treated by Melanoma Institute Australia, so they have a speakers bureau. So I approached them and said, I'm more than happy to do speaking. So as a result of that, I think I spoke once, and then I joined Melanoma Patients Australia, which is another advocacy organisation, but it looks after, people who are going through melanoma. And they invited me to speak at something. So I started getting a couple of speaking appointments and then got asked to speak at a sunscreen summit. And the person that organised that said, "Oh, could you come and talk about sunscreen advertising because, you've had a career in marketing and advertising?" I said, "Well, not really, because that's kind of very specific and there are a lot of TGA regulations around that. But what I can do is come and talk to you about how the general media and advertising environment is influencing our cultural norms." So I went and did a presentation there, and then I got approached by a number of other people to come and speak at other things. And I thought, okay, my story and my perspective on, I guess, our culture is hitting a note with people. So that's ultimately when I decided to write the book, because I felt my story was having impact and I wanted to see if I could spread my story further.
Some people might go, "Oh, she had a story, she wrote a book. How hard can that be?" And I know that writing a book is incredibly challenging because you have to both sit down and apply yourself. You have to have a structure, you have to be creative, but you also need to find a publisher. And those things can be very challenging. Were there challenges to writing the book?
Of course. Yeah. Writing a book is not a linear process. The thing that I did do was I joined a book coaching group, a group called Expert Author Community, and I got a lot of support from that. So this particular community had previously been very focused. It's focused on non-fiction, but generally B2B writers were involved in the group. So there were a lot of tools, processes about writing your book, the structure of a book, the structure of a chapter, that kind of thing. Because I was writing a memoir, those particular kind of things didn't necessarily help me as much. But what it helped me with is the writing process, like understanding that, it's not linear. And when you think that you've got there's another twist or whatever. But it also gave me insight into the publishing industry, which is a totally different industry. Having worked in marketing and advertising, I was familiar with the creative process. So that part of it, wasn't new to me, but the actual publishing industry, like that's a weird one. That's, got really, a lot of unique things, I guess the biggest stumble I had, I guess it wasn't one stumble. It was an ongoing thing that I had was, even though I said I wanted to write my story and I knew that it was impacting people, when I was going through the process, I did start to wonder, what am I doing? No one really wants to hear my story. Who wants to hear my story? It's not good enough. I've never written anything before. All these kinds of thoughts that I was having. And I had my first draft of the manuscript appraised, and this is when my major wobbly happened, rather, I guess I'd call it, rather than a stumble. I got feedback from the person who appraised the manuscript, and the way that I took the feedback, this is not necessarily what she said was, but the way I took the feedback was, apart from your, illness and your clinical journey, your life's really not that, unusual or interesting, and there's a lot of swimming in there. And I thought, okay. So then I started thinking, okay, what am I doing? Should I be doing this? But at the same time, I was actually taking 5 weeks off anyhow. I was going travelling to Europe. And I'd given the book to a couple of beta readers who were in what I call the skin cancer industry. And a couple of weeks after getting the appraisal feedback, I got feedback from the beta readers, and they all said, "You've got to tell this story. It's great. You really need to do it." And that's when I actually refocused that feedback or reinterpreted, and I thought, actually, she's right. My story is pretty much the average Australian story, or could be. And that's where the strength of my story is, because I'm just an average Aussie person living the pretty much average Aussie lifestyle. It happened to me. It can happen to you. So I reframed that feedback, and actually I feel like that's become the strength of my story now, is that, I am an average Aussie and it could happen to anyone.
How interesting that you could look at it two ways and it became a strength as opposed to... That's so interesting.
I mean, there were a few weeks there where I was utterly devastated and thought, I'm not doing this now.
I can totally imagine. And I'm just wondering, you mentioned that the first presentation you gave, it was quite emotional for you. And I do appreciate that sometimes when we tell our story more than once, it can become less emotional in the sense that they're words, they're practiced, and you've said them before. But are there times when repeating your story is actually challenging?
The only times I've found it challenging is if I have people in the audience who are close to me and they respond. So I did an author talk, for instance, at a library, and my brother interviewed me. And part of the way that I do my author talk is that I read the prologue from my book, which ends with me finding out that I've got cancer. And he got quite emotional, and like he then had to go into his part and ask the next question. And I'm looking over at him, and he's kind of, I can see that he's swallowing and got tears in his eyes and whatever. So yeah, I'm kind of been telling it now for 5 years, so I am comfortable with it. What I notice, I guess, is though different parts of my story, how the audience will react. There are some things that not surprise me, but it's just interesting to, see with different audiences the things that touch them.
Yeah. Do you think doing the book and doing your advocacy work has changed you at all?
I don't think it's changed me per se. I was struggling after I'd been sick. I was struggling to find employment that I was happy in, or to find so I'd had a great career. I loved my career. And actually about 12 months prior to becoming ill, my dream role was made redundant. And then I picked up a contract, and then I got sick, and then I got another contract. And I was just not loving any of that work. So now I love what I do. It has meaning for me, and I'm motivated by it. So I think that's the difference for me, is that I'm just happier doing this than I was. So I do this full time now. At the moment, I'm trying to build, I guess, income out of my advocacy through speaking and other activities. So that's kind of the challenge for me at the moment. But yeah, I love doing this because I just feel like I'm making a difference.
What kind of impact have you seen from your work, whether it's the book or your speaking engagements?
Because of my career, I've been very used to having pretty obvious results. So it's either a new advertising campaign, so I see the creative progressing, or, at the end of the year we see the sales results, or that kind of thing. With advocacy and what I'm doing now, it's very different. So what I'm trying to learn to appreciate is, I guess, the small things that over time I'm hoping will add up. So, last week I had a really positive conversation with someone, it may go nowhere, but I have to appreciate that for what it is. There have been some things in terms of making a difference, I guess, will help to make a difference. So I have won an award for my book. So through that, I guess that lends a bit more credibility and credentials to what I'm doing. So that can enable me to speak to more people. I'm also in a film called Conquering Skin Cancer, which is a documentary film about skin cancer. So that's enabling my story to get out to more people, which is great. I connected with someone probably about 12 months ago now on LinkedIn who is head of PDHPE, which is a subject in high school, at a girls' school in Sydney. And long story short, as a result of that, they used my book as part of a 6-week curriculum on skin cancer and skin protection. You may know I'm a keen ocean swimmer, so I approached my local beach, which is Coogee, and when they ran their ocean swim, which is, an organised event that they run twice a year, I approached them about increasing the sun protection initiatives at the event. So we introduced a couple of things, and also we had along on the day, the Melanoma Institute of Australia came along and they have like an educational booth kind of thing, and Skin Check Champions ran free skin check. So, there's kind of some initiatives that I've been able to achieve. But the thing I love the most is when, people feed back to me and they say, like I've had a couple now, actually a guy that I swim with said, a friend of mine went somewhere the other day and you were speaking. And he said it was great. And the first thing he did was he went out to a sports store and bought a rashie for his son. And then someone else I know, texted me and said, I just overheard my daughter saying, no, I've got to put on my sun protection. She's young teen. I've got to put on my sun protection or whatever it was because I know the sun can be dangerous. And, this friend of mine said, and that's because of you, because I have the conversations with her now. So they're the things that I love the most, is when I get feedback that people are changing their behaviour.
And thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Siobhan.
Anne Gately, author of Sunburnt, a memoir of sun, surf and skin cancer. Do you know someone who's making the world a better place? If you do, let me know. My email details are in the episode notes. I'm Siobhan Hunt. See you on the next episode of A Better World Blueprint.